Today we're going to talk about communication. In sales, obviously, that's what we do, is we communicate. We spend a lot of time talking about how to send information, how to make a presentation, how to talk to a client, what to say, what not to say. Today I want to focus on the receiving side, the listening side, because it's actually just as important as the sending side. In some ways, it might even be more important than the sending side. So what we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about what active listening actually is, the steps of active listening. We're going to talk about why we don't listen so well, because there's some elements that are in our everyday lives that prevent us actually from being great listeners. Then we're going to talk about the types of non-listeners, because when we know the kinds of non-listeners, we can see ourselves in that and improve. And then we're going to talk about how active listening will positively impact the sales process. So let's get started. I'm going to kind of go over the points of what good listening is, the 4 elements of it, and then I'm going to come back and we'll talk about each one in a little more detail, because it's a little more complicated than we at first thought. Good listening is step number 1. The listener is going to attend the message. That's what we always thought it was, just listening. But secondly, the listener is going to accept it. Third, they'll process it without bias. And fourth, the listener is going to respond to the sender so that the sender understands that the listener actually got the meaning that the sender intended. Now that's a lot more complicated than what we first probably thought listening was all about. So first of all, the listener attends the message. This is simply being attentive enough to get the gist of what's going on. Secondly, when the listener accepts it, that's basically saying the listener is not going to interrupt or reject what's being said outright. You ever have somebody, when you're trying to say something, actually go like that? Well, they just failed that part. Or what about when you start to talk and somebody interrupts you and you haven't even been able to finish your sentence? And you think that's rude. It is, because it indicates they're not listening. The third one is the listener processes without bias. And that means that you can't let your own thought patterns get in the way and your own opinions. So you have to understand the intent of what the sender is meaning without fighting about it. And that's extremely hard for most of us. Then, number 4 is to really get the meaning behind what the sender says. In some cases, you almost have to read their mind. They may not be great communicators. They may not do this very well. They may not have the language skills that allow them to send a message accurately or correctly, but you still, as an active listener, have to get the meaning behind that. That means you may need to probe a little, you may need to ask some questions, you may need to find out a little bit more. That's a whole lot more activity than just sitting still and letting the words flow over you. So this listening thing is a lot more complicated than what we first thought. Okay, let's talk about why we don't listen. There's a bunch of reasons that exist that prevent us from listening really well. The first one, for lack of a good phrase, I guess, is our stuff. And I call this our insecurities, our own values, our opinions, our inner fears, and just our experiences that we see life through our experiential prism. Now, for example, Christy, I'm going to pick on you for just a second. Let's say you're in a room and you perceive that you're not very good at numbers. Now, you haven't really told anybody that. You just perceive, I'm not very good with statistics and I don't understand numbers all that well. And in walks the presenter, and he opens up the PowerPoint, and it's full of statistical information and graphs and all sorts of Excel spreadsheets, and you just shut down because you say to yourself, I'm not good at this. And so because your own little inner voice is saying, I'm not good at this, I'm not good at this, and he's explaining all of these things, you shut down, take a mental vacation. He continues to talk. You're sitting there, the words are passing over you, but nothing's happening. That's our own insecurities. That's what happens. That prevents us from listening well. Then there's simple fatigue. You can spend 75% of your day in a position to be listening to somebody. That's tiring. Because as we've talked already, there's a tremendous amount to this listening thing that we hadn't thought about before. We can have a preoccupation with our own concerns. Now, I don't mean that we're selfish or even lazy here. That's not what I'm talking about. It's just that we've become so conditioned to think that it's the sender's responsibility to communicate rather than the receiver's to communicate, meaning to process and feedback, that we're kind of on the lazy side because we think that it's your job to explain it to me, not my job to understand what you just said. And then the fourth one of why we don't listen is just the physiological reality that we can listen 80% faster than people can talk. So what happens is while we're waiting for them to get to the point, we get either bored or impatient and we take this little mental vacation. So they're talking and we're gone. And that's complicated. And it really interferes with getting all the information. Now I want to talk about the kinds of non-listeners. There's types of non-listeners, and I want to go over these because we can see ourselves in some of these labels. And when you can see yourself in a category, you can say, gosh, I can change that. So you can choose to change the kind of non-listener you might be. So we have the selective listener. This listener will take in information and he'll pick and choose what parts that he wants to actually hold on to. So this person will just pick and choose and just reject certain things. Most women will say that their husbands are selective listeners. They pick and choose and don't hear half of what I'm saying. Then you have the insulated listener, and this listener actually seems to hear everything, but they seem to be in denial of parts of that information. So you can be talking to somebody, and this is the time when you'll say something to test somebody if they're listening. You'll say something really silly that just kind of goes over their head. Well, they're kind of in denial. They're just absolutely not hearing everything. This guy kind of chooses not to hear certain things. This one really doesn't seem to hear it. The defensive listener is exactly the polar opposite to the insulated listener. This guy hears it loud and clear, and he does not like it. So he can be very combative, he can be very aggressive, and he's not going to accept that easily. And this is the guy that is very condescending. He can have an air of superiority about him. And this is the one that is the expert. Have you ever tried to explain something to somebody who thinks he's more expert than you are over an issue?